Okay, this is Ty Johnson. I'm here with Mike Shafer at Shafer's Slot Cars. It is 12:15, November 13th, on a Sunday. First question I got is, where was your birthplace at?
I was born in Grand Island, Nebraska,
The date you were born,
August 12th, 1953.
and your father's name,
Harold Shafer.
and what was his background?
My dad was an iron worker and a cattle rancher, and he is a Korean War combat veteran.
And your mother's name?
Twyla States. She was remarried after my parents were divorced, and she was a registered nurse at Grand Island.
Then do you have any siblings at all?
I have a sister who's a real estate agent, Michelle, and I have two half-brothers, Mark, who works for Builder's Warehouse, and Matt, who's an electrician at the Veterans Home.
Okay, and your family origins, such as faith, hobbies, just any of that set?
Family origins. First of all, we're of German ancestry on both sides. My personal hobbies, auto racing, football, education.
Then, what did you do as a child in your youth, teenage years, and leading to war?
Well, with my parents being divorced, I was shuffled back and forth. My dad being a cattle rancher, I had the chores of, herding cattle, dehorning cattle, building fence, cutting hay, throwing hay bales, that sort of stuff. And then when I was with my mom, I basically did odd jobs. I had a friend who was a mechanic, and I worked for them part-time.
Okay, then for your chores growing up, you kind of mentioned about all that on the farm.
Mm-hmm.
Then for marriages, when did you get married?
I got married in 1973, but it didn't last very long. I have one daughter from that, and I was married for about a year and got divorced, and then I got custody of my daughter, so I was a single parent until my daughter graduated from high school. Then I was remarried in 1998, and I've been married ever since.
Okay, then we're going to start on the main part of the interview. So, in the beginning of the war, what were you doing prior to the war starting or prior to your awareness of the war?
Well, I was very young. The war started, originally in 1959 when the United States went in with advisors. And then after the war escalated in 1964 and 1965, I was in middle school. During that time, I was in high school during the Tet Offensive and the real brutal part of the war. And then by the time I graduated in 1971, the war was beginning to slow down. They weren't sending near as many troops there, but it was a very, very frightening situation.
Okay, then so what were your thoughts going through your head when the Vietnam War was around, your age and the normal involvement? You said it was more of a frightening environment. Is there anything else you could say on that part?
Well, the fear of having to go, fighting in the jungle and doing something that the French had been unsuccessful with. The United States was really torn apart at the time. It was on the one side you had the Hawks with the love it or leave it type attitude, and you had the Doves, the hippies that weren't going no matter what. And being the child of a Marine Corps staff sergeant, I was really torn between doing duty for my country and then being scared to death for my own life and the life of my friends.
So, did you want to join the Army, and could you, and if not, and why?
Well, when I went through in 1971, I went through the lottery. We had the draft, the National Selective Service, and in the lottery, basically, they had ping pong balls that had a date 365, and whatever date your ping pong ball came out was when you were drafted. And so we all got together and watched the draft on national television. And I had decided that if I was drafted, I would go. I was working for my dad that summer, and he came up to me one day and he said, "Well, if you get drafted, what are you going to do?" And I said, "Well, if I get drafted, I will go." But then I proceeded to say, if I get drafted, I will probably enlist, either in the Air Force or the Navy, because if you enlisted, you got to choose your branch of service. And then my dad said something that stopped me in my tracks. He said, "No, you won't. If you get drafted, I'll haul your ass to Canada myself." And then he told me, "You're not losing your life in that piece of shit war." And it really stunned me, as my dad was a combat veteran from Korea. And it was really a life-changing experience. As luck would have it, my lottery number came out 274th out of 365. So I did not get drafted. And then I obviously became a single parent shortly after that. And at that point, I couldn't even enlist. So it was a very, very frightening time, and it's really the time that set me on the path to becoming a history teacher.
Okay, so what was your understanding of why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam?
Well, the official stance was the domino theory. You know, the Truman Doctrine basically said that we're going to stop the spread of communism anytime, anywhere, at whatever cost. And the Johnson administration was worried that if Vietnam fell, then that domino would spread communism all throughout Southeast Asia. Quite honestly, I didn't believe it then, and I don't believe it now. I really don't know. In hindsight, it was a hell of a terrible war that killed a lot of people needlessly, in my opinion.
Okay, then about all the information on the war, and how did you receive all that, and when you found out all that information, did it ever change your perspective?
Absolutely. You know, Vietnam was the first televised war, you know, and I always made the point to say that, you know, you can read numbers and statistics out of a book, but that is not as devastating as watching human beings being stuffed into body bags on national television while you're sitting there listening to Walter Cronkite on the evening news during dinner time. And I think the media played a huge role in the opposition to the war.
Okay, then will you describe the atmosphere, what people were feeling during the war? Mainly in the beginning of, like, when you were
Well,
starting.
in the very beginning, you know, we supported the war. You know, we had just come off of a huge victory in World War II, victory if you can call it. And then the Korean War, which we basically just kind of forgot about because of the aftermath of the suffering during World War II. But then when we began to listen to President Johnson say, you know, they attacked us at the Gulf of Tonkin, we supported that. You know, we as a nation said, you know, the president made this decision, we need to stand up for him. And it really wasn't until, in my eyes, we started seeing the true horrors of war coming into our living rooms that we began to really question why we're even there.
Okay, so we're coming to the middle of the war. Tell me about your experiences during the Vietnam War. What did you do during the war?
Well, again, during the really heated part of the war, I was still in high school.
Mm-hmm.
So it was as a spectator reading that. I did have a high school classmate's brother that was killed in Vietnam, and it ruined that family's life. And we watched the demise of Dewey Strubing's family kind of pull back into isolation. And really, at that time, we were all so young, we didn't know really how to react. We didn't know why he died. We hoped that it was for a good reason, but it was still a terrible tragedy. And then I had some of my other friends that I knew went off to war, and I watched them come home as just shells of human beings, and it was a terrible time.
And you said how your friends, you guys used to sit and watch the national televised of the draft. Did a lot of your friends go and fight, or what did they end up doing?
I did have some that were drafted. I don't have any classmates that were drafted went to Vietnam. Some of them went to Germany, some of them went to Korea, some of them stayed stateside. I had some friends that enlisted. One friend, for sure, I know was in the Navy offshore, and they would shoot their big guns from the battleships in there. I had another friend that enlisted that was an infantryman, and he is just totally wasted as a human being. It has affected him horribly. I have a couple friends right now that are dying from Agent Orange, that have had severe health problems the entire time, and I watched them battle the VA, not getting treatment, being denied treatment. And I have another friend that had both of his arms blown off in Vietnam, and I can't imagine the life he's had to lead. So it was just a war is a terrible, horrible, miserable, suffering, everything bad known to man. It's a terrible situation.
You said one of your friends was suffering from Agent Orange. Can you describe more about that?
Well, we sprayed Agent Orange over the top of them to kill the jungle so we could see the enemy. Philosophy is probably sound, but we sprayed it right on top of our troops. And every single one of them has developed tumors, neurological diseases, and cancer. And the horrible part was, again, for decades, they were refused treatment at the VA, and the government officially said it had nothing to do with it, which is absolute crap. So again, it's terrible. Those guys not everyone that was killed in Vietnam died in country. They died after they got home due to the effects of the war.
Well, with your friends that did go over, did you ever communicate with them?
Yeah, I've tried as a non-combatant, as a civilian. They have experiences that none of us can ever relate to, but I have a wide circle of friends that served over there, and it's been 40 years or more, and they're finally just starting to open up a little bit about their experiences. And one of the things I told them as a teacher is, if you guys don't tell me these stories, we can't teach about them, because their stories are not in the history books. So they're just starting to get the credit, the admiration they deserve. These guys didn't want to go to war either. They went because their country sent them, and they did the job that our government asked them to do. But then, as a nation, we turned our backs on them, and that's immoral.
Okay, then how are the soldiers treated, and do they get proper care while they're at war? Do you know anything about that?
I think while they were at war, the MASH units began in Korea, and a lot of guys survived in Vietnam that would have perished in World War II. So I think their treatment during the war was actually the best we could possibly provide. But I think, much like what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq and the Middle East today, we were totally unprepared for the injuries and the treatment. There was no psychological treatment like there is today. There was no time to decompress from Vietnam. These guys got on an airplane. They might be fighting in the jungle for their lives in 48 hours sitting in a bar in San Francisco or Honolulu. And they had no time to adjust to that. So once they turned out of Vietnam, they came home, they were spit on, they were called baby killers, they were called rapists, they were called criminals, they were called everything in the book except hero and warrior. And so despite the injuries they got there, then they had the psychological disadvantage of being berated by the country that sent them to war. It was a terrible situation.
Okay, during the war, what was your mother? Was your mother doing? Your father and your siblings?
Well, my mom was the head nurse in obstetrics at St. Francis, so she was just working. You know, the war didn't affect us, again, because as the oldest child, I was too young to go while I was in high school, and my mom was pretty non-political, as was my stepdad. Now, my real father, the Marine Corps sergeant, obviously he paid a lot of attention to it to make the comments that he made to me. He was dead set against Vietnam, I think due to his experiences in Korea, where they would take a hill, kill a bunch of guys, and then they would retreat. And then a month later, they go take the same hill, kill a bunch of guys, and retreat. We repeated that in Vietnam. And I think that was, he died too young for me to ever really get into this, and he would never discuss it with me while he was alive. But from what I can understand, I can put those two things together, that we didn't fight Vietnam to win, we fought it for the economic reasons. I really don't know why we fought it.
Okay, then for the economy in your home state, which would be Nebraska, here in Grand Island, could you tell me about any of that, like just kind of like the small things, like gallon of gas, gallon of milk? What was the prices on things? Did everything go
Well,
up?
the Vietnam helped the economy in Hall County because we had the bomb factory. The ammunition out at the ammo plant was building bombs for Vietnam, and it employed about 2,000 people. It really did help the economy of Hall County. As far as the prices, gasoline when I was in high school was about a quarter a gallon. Milk was about 50 cents a gallon. Loaf of bread was 15 or 20 cents. New automobile was $2,500. Payments on a brand new house, probably about 100 to 150 bucks a month. But minimum wage was 90 cents an hour also.
Yeah. So, before you said about the ordnance plant, did you know anybody that ever worked out there? Did you?
Well, I know a lot of people that worked at the ordnance plant, and it was very interesting. Some of them were veterans, and they told me, it was a hard thing to build weapons for war at the same time our boys were being killed by some of those same weapons, But people have to make a living, and that was the best paying job around. People stood in line to get jobs out there, and it was built for World War II, and they built bombs for World War II, Korea, and then into Vietnam.
Okay, so then when you come to the end of the war, as of your part of life, what could you explain in one word about what the war could have been?
Well, relief. I will never forget when the war was finally announced as officially over, when Saigon fell and we got everyone out of there. I remember specifically feeling like this cloud is gone. And I thought to myself, we finally learned our lesson. We're never going to do this again. I couldn't have been more wrong. When we look at what's going on in the Middle East, it's the same roadmap all over again. So it's very, very disgusting. We can't learn our lessons from history.
This is kind of like a question that's kind of goes from what we were just kind of talking about. The food, like that's something I'm curious about. What was the food as a whole like from beginning to the end of the war?
The food as far as what we ate here?
What we ate and what your friends, if you ever talked to them about what they had to eat, just kind of something fun.
First of all, there was very little fast food. Fast food really, like McDonald's. McDonald's didn't come to Grand Island until after the Vietnam War. That we had drive-ins, like an A&W type thing. But that was a situation where they didn't make food until you ordered it. But most people ate at home. Most families ate together, at least the dinner time or the supper time meal. And if you weren't there to eat, you didn't eat. You know, there was people ate together as families. We seldom, I remember going to a McDonald's in Lincoln in high school. I think hamburgers were 15 cents a piece, and it was a real treat because we never did that. Pizza, there were Pizza Huts back in the time, and that's probably the biggest thing we had to going out for a meal was going to a Pizza Hut at that time.
So then I got my last questions. They're all going to be ones that we were required. We had some earlier. Tell me about a specific experience from Vietnam War that you can't forget, or your most vivid memory of the time period. I know you mentioned how it was horrible watching the first televised national televised war.
Mm-hmm.
But is there anything else you can elaborate on any of that?
Well, one of the stories that it didn't affect me until later was, during Vietnam, they were totally unprepared for casualties, and there was a Grand Island boy killed in Vietnam, and his family priest saw him loaded into a body bag while on television before the family was ever notified. And that priest got into his car and went over and knocked on the door and asked if the family had heard from their son, and they hadn't heard a word, and they had not seen their son's body on television. So he tried very gently to break it to him, basically saying that I think he's been hurt, and he didn't tell him. But then oftentimes they would just get a telegram saying that their son or their father or their brother had been killed. And again, we were totally unprepared for all that stuff. And that kind of thing affects us. I did have a high school classmate that went on to be basically a sniper, and he was a changed human being. He was kind of a happy-go-lucky, carefree guy, and he came home a very, very dark, closed-off person. So those are just one specific thing. I'd have a hard time pointing to it. It's just a collection of a lot of different things.
Okay, you said how they didn't let the families know about if any of their kids were killed in war. Do you think the government could have went about that a whole different way,
Absolutely.
a way better way?
Absolutely. These days they send some local military people. They'll have a priest or a rabbi or a pastor or someone that they can go and inform the families personally. Even though it is horrible, I can't imagine getting that information. At least you get it from a compassionate human being rather than a telegram delivered by a cab driver or something.
So once the war was over, did life ever return to normal, or were things permanently changed? That's talking about the people that were in war, then just the general life here in Grand Island.
Well, life returned to normal fairly quickly for those of us that didn't go, and those of us that did not have family members. It's like everything else. We just got up and we went to work every day. Some of the violence, the demonstrations in the streets obviously stopped when the war was over. But the families of the combatants that came home to terrible prejudice and discrimination. I know some guys that couldn't even get a job. They would never mention that they were combatants in Vietnam because people would spit at them. They would call them terrible names, a terrible discrimination, against the warrior.
You mentioned earlier in the interview about how all the protests, you had the doves and such. Was there much of that in Grand Island, or?
I didn't see anything in Grand Island, and I went to Kearney State College at the time in Kearney, and we didn't see anything there, but My wife was at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and they had huge demonstrations that actually shut down campus for days at a time, protesting against the war. But again, at that time, my wife is 2 years older than me, so she got to see things down there in Lincoln while I was still in high school. You know, she was in Lincoln in 1969 and 70 when the war was still raging at a violent clip, and I was still in high school. So we did not see those massive demonstrations here in town, but it was on the nightly news every night.
So for the protest, what was your personal thoughts on all those people? Were they just had lost cause? Were they?
Well, I was personally very conflicted, wanting to follow in my dad's footsteps. I wanted to be a Marine like my dad. I admired that. I grew up believing in serving your country, but I did not believe in the war in Vietnam. I thought it was for a phony reason, as did my dad. And I hate to be selfish, I didn't want to die for no reason. And I'm not saying those guys did. I respect those guys and admire them. So I was torn between wanting to be with them and yet not believing in why we were there. And it was hard. It was a very, very difficult time.
Okay, so then what do you think we could have done differently as a nation as a whole?
Never gone. And that's easy for me to say. But the feeling at the time was, coming out of World War II, there was a genuine fear of the spread of communism. We had an American Communist Party, up until the 1950s, and being a capitalist republic democracy, there was a genuine fear of communism, which in hindsight seems so phony. The communism that we feared was really nothing but a dictatorship, But I thought at the time, and I still believe today, communism was destined to fail on its own. I don't see why we needed to get involved. Obviously the French wanted to keep South Vietnam and North Vietnam as their colony to enrich their own country. That is wrong. I believe that Ho Chi Minh believed in self-rule he wanted Vietnamese people to rule Vietnam. I agree with that, Could we have done something different? I think when Ho Chi Minh approached us for help after World War II to establish his own government, I think we could have kept communism out of there at that time. But to go in and pick up arms from the French, no. It was a mistake all the way around.
So then, I remember from being in high school history with you, I believe it was Richard Nixon. What did you think of how he took his stance on the war with how I think that was the president who was kind of against it all. He told everybody, I'll give you a better deal. He kept holding everything off.
Yeah, Nixon's the first person I ever voted for president because he had promised to get us out of the war before Christmas of 1972. And we were still in there. We didn't get out till 1975, And I told you in class, it's not polite to speak ill of the dead, but Nixon was so crooked when he died, they had to screw him into the ground, And that's personal for me, We could have gotten out of there just like we could get out of the Middle East today. My opinion. Well, I shouldn't say that because I think the reasons in the Middle East are much more complicated. But Nixon escalated the war for whatever reason. He took that to his grave. But I just thoroughly despised Nixon at that time, because I thought he was extending a war that we didn't have to be in. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah. So you think for the presidents after him, do you think it really affected them with what he did on the war?
Well, Nixon, it certainly affected President Ford, who pardoned Nixon basically for the Watergate scandal. But it's been very difficult to judge the effect of Vietnam, I would say, since then, because a lot of people, say the nation's 50% for the war, 50% against it. I think both sides could appreciate the other's point of view during that time, much different than they can today. I think the people that were against the war because they didn't want people to die. The people that were for the war were supporting the government because they were sending them there. So I'm not really sure. It didn't take very long for non-service people, non-Vietnam type people, to be in our national government. I don't know if that answers your question, Ty.
Yeah. Then before we cap everything off, I just kind of want to go like an overview. For what lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about the time in history? Like,
pay attention to what's going on. I think we get so complacent, and our lives in the United States are so good and so soft. The greatest lottery we have ever won is being born in the United States. And I think that leads to complacency. People do not pay attention to what's going on. Say, for instance, a person listens to Fox News exclusively, or to CNN exclusively, or MSNBC exclusively. We've gotten very, very lazy-brained. We don't think, we don't read between the lines, we don't research, we just don't pay attention. We're like a bunch of sheep being led to the slaughter. My experience is that cannot sustain itself. We have got to get involved, and we've got to pay attention to what's going on. If not, I guess we get what we deserve.
okay, then have your views over the war changed over time?
I was against the war in high school. Now I'm 63 years old. I'm even more against it. However, I'm in staunch support of our soldiers. Those guys did the job we asked them to do. They deserve our respect. They deserve our admiration. They deserve our help. A lot of people could not separate the war from the warrior, and I've never understood that. They're blaming the soldier for the evils of the policies, and I think that is wrong. We should support those guys, even if you're dead set against the war. Don't take it out on the people that fought the war. And I hope that's not the case. And I've seen a big change, in your lifetime, of the support of our veterans when they come home from the Middle East. Excuse me. They are supported, whereas the Vietnam veterans were not.
So we're restarting the interview. It's 12:52. Something I want to talk about is the Vietnam War engaged in all over the country. I mean, all over the world. You mentioned how you had people that went to Germany. Myself, I had a great uncle that guarded the Panama Canal. He said that it was a big waste of his time when they just eventually just let people go straight back through it after building it. What's your thoughts about on all that?
Well, my friends, two come to mind. One that served in Germany in the Army, and another served in South Korea in the Army. My buddy that was in Germany, you ask him about his experiences, and he'll just say, we drank a lot of beer. And my buddy that served in Korea, they smoked a lot of dope. So it was, through the luck of the draw, they ended up not going to Vietnam into combat. So their experiences during the Vietnam War were vastly different than my friends that were actually in combat dodging bullets. You talk to those two guys today, and their time in the Army was kind of a waste of their time. They, while they're proud to serve their country, I think they both would argue that they didn't do a hell of a lot. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Then on the Panama Canal, what were your thoughts over all that area?
Well, again, the Panama Canal. We, being a civilian back here, we didn't pay any attention to it. It was, a waterway connecting the two oceans. It was never in the news much. We just, I don't know. We just never paid any attention to it. I guess the media was so much more focused on either the war in Vietnam or the demonstrations in the streets that we didn't hear a heck of a lot about it during that time.
For all those guys that were down there, do you think their glory was kind of put off? They're just taken for granted.
Worse than that, they were abused for it. There was no glory. There was no homecoming. There was no reception. There was, if they had anything, it was discrimination. They were treated horribly. It wasn't the fact that they were ignored. They were refused jobs. I know one guy went to get a checking account in a bank, and the teller threw the paperwork at him. She wouldn't even open a checking account with him because he had returned from Vietnam. That's how terribly split our nation had become. Again, they were spit on. They had things thrown at them. It was unbelievable what happened to them. And it is this generation of Vietnam veterans that have really turned the tide towards our Middle Eastern veterans. I watched this happen in the last decade or so, where the Vietnam veterans basically said there will never be another generation of soldier treated the way they were. So this kind of resurgence of patriotism and thankfulness towards our returning veterans in the Middle East is really started by the Vietnam veterans that were treated so horribly and didn't want to see another generation of soldier being treated that way.
For the Vietnam War veterans, do you think we owed them something? How our nation treated them terribly? Do you think they should be held a little bit higher than anybody else? That it was kind of a pointless war?
Well, I don't know we should treat the Vietnam veteran any differently than we should treat the Korean War, World War II, Iraq, Afghanistan, Nicaragua. They should all command our respect. Let's take the word should out of it. We need to take care of these guys mentally and physically. Sadly enough, it's far too late for a lot of them, but they command our utmost respect and thanks. Only 3% of the nation's men serve in uniform. That's a very, very small minority that do 100% of the fighting for us, and we need to honor them.
Then, with you being a high school history teacher, and it seems like to me like your specialty area, we've been here in Grand Island been sending our Korean War veterans to D.C. Do you think we need to do that for all the Vietnam guys? How do you think that we should?
Yes. In fact, we sent one flight of Vietnam veterans last spring on a hero flight. And as a member of the Patriot Guard, I was there, when we welcomed these guys out on the tarmac. The interesting thing that I found was, in talking to some of these, and I had some of my friends on that flight, they were unprepared for what they saw when they got home. I don't know if you were out there, Ty, but when they flew in to Grand Island, there were thousands of people there. The Northwest High School band was there, the Patriot Guard were there, and thousands of Grand Island citizens were there. And the guys told me that as they turned the plane to come on the landing strip, they saw the reception that they were getting, and they said the plane was just full of tears. And some of them said, "There's even a band there," and none of them ever got this when they returned home. So I expected it to be very emotional for the soldiers, but what I was not expecting was the reaction of the wives. As the wives saw the reception that their husbands got, it was just, I get emotional thinking about it. The wives just broke down and sobbed because, you think of it, they are the ones that live with the nightmares and the health problems and the fear that they must have had as their loved ones were off to war. They also suffered during the war, and they have suffered with their husbands this whole time. So it was very, very heartwarming to see them get the reception that they got. Just last Thursday, we did another fundraiser at Northwest on Thursday. And last year we raised enough money to send one person, just Northwest, paid for the cost of one more Vietnam veteran going to D.C. And I haven't heard the numbers yet this week, but hopefully we will have done that also to send another person. And I was talking to Gary Quant and Linda Green. We've got enough for 2 more hero flights to Vietnam. So we're going to be raising money for at least another year, a year and a half to get those guys all there. And they deserve to go. Some of those guys that I talked to didn't want to go. And I talked to them, I says, "You deserve this." And they ended up, another fascinating thing is they had such a wonderful time. And I've been in D.C. when some of the hero flights have been there. And I've seen the reception the soldiers get on the National Mall when the tourists that are there see these guys. It's been very, very heartwarming to see the reception the soldiers get while they're in D.C. by complete, total strangers. The things that they did not get when they returned home from combat 40-some years ago. So now a lot of the guys that were really, really reluctant to even think about going on one of the hero flights have listened to the stories of the guys that went there on the first one, and they're coming out of the woodwork signing up. So I hope we as a community can continue to raise enough to get every single one of them a flight back there.
If you look at, for like our Vietnam Wall, I think it's around 58,000 that's on it. If you look at the Vietnam side, they lost, huge percentage. I think it was like 2 million, 3 million, such. If that would have been, we talked in class about if we turned it around, that would have been the American wall, that it would have been 200-some thousand with our percentage of population at that time. Do you think our nation as a whole would have pulled out quicker? Do you think we would have? What's your views on that, if you have any?
That's something I never thought about, Ty. Yeah, I think in my lifetime, the protests against the war, even though the war drug on and on and on, if we would not have had the protests, I think the war might have continued. as long as we're in the Middle East right now. Do we see any huge protests against what's going on in the Middle East? No, we don't. You know, the United States is not at war in the Middle East. The United States military is, but the United States is not at war. You and I are not suffering. We are not, you know, helping, unless you're a family member of a soldier. We are not suffering at all for what's going on over there, and I think that's immoral. You know, had the demonstrations never taken place against the war in Vietnam, I think it would have drawn on further. If we would have had massive casualties percentage-wise like the Vietnamese, would we have pulled out? Thinking back at the time, I think we would have resorted to the nuclear bomb first, and then maybe we would have. You know, again, it was to me, totally unjust war. And if we'd have had more casualties, gosh, I don't know. I have never really thought about that.
Then you said with the protests, how that kept going on. That kind of helps end the war. And you think how people today need to kind of learn from history about all that. If you look about the presidential election that just happened, are all the protesters still protesting for the right of what they have? Like, are they protesting the correct way, like such as the Vietnam War protesters did? And now, did they ever burn any flags like they are today?
Oh yeah.
Or
yeah, they did back in the day also, which was very, very controversial. Again, as I watched those demonstrators burn those flags back in the 60s, I thought, are you kidding me? Again, for me personally, it was so hard. The personal struggles I had with wanting to serve my country, but yet not wanting to die. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, who wants to die?
Yeah.
You know, you still want to do something, but I never could understand burning the flag and picking on our soldiers, if you were, because again, for the luck of a ping pong ball coming out of a machine, I would have been one of them. You know.
Mm-hmm.
Comparing it to this election cycle, no comparison. I mean, what I see going on today is totally different, you know. And I think, again, we did not learn the lessons of what we went through. Our lives are too easy. We have too much money. We are too materialistic. We're too damn lazy. And I think what's going on today is just a bunch of whining, you know, because the people that are bitching and complaining and whining, they're not out there working to make it better. I do believe that the protesters in the 60s had a mentality that they wanted to change. The protesters of today are just whining. What do they want? I don't know. They want... You tell me. You're a younger generation than me. What do they want, Ty? I don't know. You know.
And that's why I wanted to talk about how protesters, how they've changed, and their meaning has pretty much gone away. And
well, I think back in the 60s, the protesters were there for a reason. I think they genuinely believed we should not be in Vietnam. They genuinely believed it was an unjust war. I know the protesters today, there's a percentage of them that are hired. You know, they are people that just want to go raise hell and get on the news, and it's completely phony. I don't see them really today having any effect, you know. I have a hard time with them, you know. Some of them may genuinely believe in a cause, but I know it's been proven that those people are bussed in and are paid a wage to go raise hell. That's just crap.
Then we talked a little bit about Ho Chi Minh earlier that you mentioned. What do you all think about him and how he wanted to make how he wanted to make Vietnam, and how the war split between North and South of an entire country?
Well, again, if the United States would have aided Ho Chi Minh, we could have established a at least semi-democratic society in Vietnam. We had the opportunity to help do that, but due to our arrogance or lack of interest, we chose not to do it. I do not blame Ho Chi Minh in the least bit for doing what he did, because he turned to a communist government for help and was willing to help. They stepped up where we did not, and I'm not supporting communism in any way, shape, or form. But he simply wanted to get out from underneath the yoke of the French, who were dominating them as a colony, and he wanted Vietnam for the Vietnamese. Would we want the Russians to come in here and colonize the United States? I mean, didn't we fight a revolutionary war against the English for that very same thing? You know, how can we look down on Ho Chi Minh for doing what he did when that's exactly what we did? We wanted America for Americans. Ho Chi Minh wanted Vietnam for the Vietnamese.
Then talking about more like how the North and South was divided, we were pretty much hiding in the cities in the beginning because everybody thought that was a safe spot, and everybody just fought in the jungle. Well, what was your thoughts about how when America brought in more people, more of our troops, and started killing pretty much everybody to find the Viet Cong, because you didn't know if they were friend or foe?
Well, let me tell you a quick story. I have a friend of mine from Iowa who was in the Special Forces. He lived in the villages amongst the Vietnamese people. He was in military intelligence. He dressed like a Vietnamese. He lived in a hut. It was his job to gather information so we could strike and kill the Viet Cong. He told me 3 years ago that he got intelligence that there was a village that was a Viet Cong stronghold. So he called in an airstrike and a raid on this village, and they went in there and they killed everybody, over 200 people, basically in an hour. When they went in there, it was nothing but women and children. And he has not been able to sleep since. You know, the horror of seeing all these mangled bodies that is a result of an order that he gave. His life has been lost. He said he will never forget that. He doesn't live in a house, he lives in a camper, and he tows his motorcycle and his Jeep around the country. He never relaxes. He's a chain smoker. He's got terrible, terrible health problems. But the nightmares that guy must have, how could you live with yourself? You know, I just, and for that, he did the best he could, and innocent people lost their lives. I can't imagine the horror of living like that.
Then how you mentioned, like, that point right there kind of didn't really help all the soldiers, how they were yelled at being called baby killers and all. What do you think, since how much you know about this war, what do you think that America should have done? Do you think they should have sent people in to actually kind of scout everything out, even though it would have been terribly dangerous? Or how do you think they could have gone about that?
Well, I don't believe we fought the war to win. You know, here's another quick story. With the veterans group that I ride motorcycles with, I had a Army drill sergeant who was a good friend of mine, and I said, you know, with my 60s class, I said, Top, if you came to my class, what would be the one thing that you would want my students to know above all else? And he told me, he said, Mike, he said, I was never in country. He said, I was a drill instructor for Vietnam. He said, but I was never in country. Let me go get somebody that can answer that question. So he went and got another guy that was a college professor, and I'd known the guy, I just didn't realize his background. And so we were visiting, and he said, let me ask you this. Do you ever teach, or have you ever heard that the United States lost that war in Vietnam? I said, I never teach it that way, but it was a common conception of the war, that the United States lost that war. He said, let me tell you something. The United States military won 100% of the firefights we were in. We won every single battle. So if we win 100% of the battles, how in the hell did we lose a war? That is the media. You know, how would you judge who wins or loses if you kill them all? I don't know, you know. But I think there's a lot of the military part of Vietnam that was never made public because it was such a political war fought through the media. You know, the United States military didn't lose that war. I think we lost it in the media.
Then in class we have books that are signed to us. They had reporters, you know, the people had press passes and whatnot. They had a free pass to go on anything and everything. They could go anywhere they want. They got on helicopters. Do you think that was kind of like a cheap way to be involved in the war? How they have to actually, they weren't on the front line.
Yeah, I think it's good and bad. I think it's good because it brought the horror of the war out in front, but it's bad because that individual can also paint it and set it up and edit it in such a way that can construe what they want the people to know. I know Walter Cronkite, who I think Uncle Walter was a legendary broadcaster. When he went over there, and he was a World War II correspondent in Europe, he came back and said basically, we can't win this war, you know. And in fact, Nixon said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country, you know. So I think it's good and I think it's bad. Now for those guys to get on a helicopter and fly into a combat zone the minute it's over, and then expect to walk up to a soldier who's just survived or has been wounded and try and get a story from them, my gosh, that's immoral. You know, I think that's wrong.
Yeah. Then just kind of touch up on everything. Do you wish from the beginning to when the draft started, you overall wish it was done differently so you could have gone, or wish that you would have moved to Canada? I wish your dad would have dragged you. How does that go over?
You know, and I was very conflicted when my dad told me that. Number one, I did not want to move to Canada. I didn't want to be thought of as a coward. But again, obviously he thought the war in Vietnam shouldn't be fought. As a wounded combat veteran, I would take his word for it. And again, I wish he would have lived long enough that I could have had more conversations about that. In a sense, there's a tremendous amount of guilt that I feel for not going, having friends that served over there, not having served my country. I think we all need to. But again, when your country does something that you think is wrong, are you duty bound to do what they want anyway? That's a hard thing, you know. Even in combat, you are given an obligation. If you get an immoral order, it is your duty to not obey that order. Well, is that cut and dried? Is that the same for everyone? I don't know. Could we have done something different? I would love to say we could. I think nations sometimes get backed into a corner they can't get out of. And I think in a great sense, that's what Vietnam was. Would I have liked to have done something different? you know, I always have this tremendous guilt for not serving, but then I see when we visit VA homes and hospitals, and I see my friends hiding and cowering in their homes at night, I also thank God I wasn't one of them. I have had a great life, and I'm no different than the guys whose number came out and got sent over there and their lives were ruined. I am so fortunate. I can't believe it. Would I want to change places with him? No way.
And you said, kind of like ending the war, how we eventually, when the United States started backing out, how we just started training the Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that was the best way to get out so our men wouldn't die themselves?
Well, I think it was a way to try and save face. We're doing the same thing in the Middle East again, like we did a decade ago, trying to train the the Iraqis to defend themselves. Well, at some point in time, they need to take care of themselves. Can we help them? Well, I remember when we helped a freedom fighting group fight the Russians, and we sent aid to a guy named Osama bin Laden. We supplied him with weapons and arms and money to fight the Russians. How did that work out for us?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know. And again, that's me as a spectator sitting here in Grand Island. I'm not in Washington, D.C. I know that I don't know all the ins and outs of what's going on, but I just have to have hope that we will elect people that make decisions to not get us backed into these corners. And I do fear when we have leaders that have never served, leaders that have never been in combat, when we have old men ordering young men into war, I'm not sure that's a good thing. You know, I personally feel if I was in Congress or in DC, if I felt strongly enough about going to war that I would go myself, then maybe we need to go. But I'll be damned if I'll declare a war to send you.
Mm-hmm.
That's wrong.
Well, that kind of tops everything off that we talked about in the interview. I don't know if you have anything else to say on it that you think should be said so other people can know, or just anything else you want to top off?
Well, I would just hope that hopefully we have a young generation that's coming up that will be more involved and pay more attention. Historically, nations don't pay attention to what's going on until we hit very, very rock bottom, or there are terrible tragedies that happen that shake us back to our core and make us wake up to what's going on. I do not want to see that happen, but history tells us it probably will. That's why we need to pay attention.
Well, thanks for giving this interview. That concludes everything, and it's 1:22.
It's been my pleasure.